Something interesting that I've noticed across the fitness space is most lifters, they get progressive overload wrong, or at least they only get a quarter to maybe half of the picture of what progressive overload actually is if they're lucky. And so it's not really anybody's fault because I fell into it for a long time, like for a very long time. And it's just because most of the things that people preach to us are, just add weight, do more reps, do more sets, and then you're for sure going to grow from that. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it's also why so many lifters spin their wheels for years where the weight might be going up, but they don't really look a whole lot different. You may add some mass, but you're not going to add the muscle that you actually ultimately want to. And that's just because your body doesn't just adapt to more weight. It adapts to the quality of the stimulus that you give it. And so that's the part that most people, like fitness influencers especially, which is, God, just drives me crazy. That's what they miss, right? They throw around the term progressive overload without ever actually explaining what it actually means and how you, more importantly, the perspective you need to have on it or how you need to actually look at it. And that's because progressive overload, it's not something that you do. It is not an action. It is something that happens. You don't do progressive overload any more than you do ROI or return on investment in business or investing. It is a result, not an actual rep scheme. And so progressive overload isn't a tactic or a training cue. It is a principle and a concept, and it describes what must happen over time in order for your body to adapt. And so you have to think of it like a KPI in business. If you don't know what that stands for, it just stands for key performance indicator. And it is a lagging indicator, meaning it happens after all of the inputs that your system or your training is working. And so it's not something that you force. You observe it, and then you create the proper conditions in order for the outcome that you want to ultimately emerge. So progressive overload is a result. It is not an actual lever that you pull. It is a direction you can go into, but it is not an actual action that you take in regards to your training. And so you have to start to think of progressive overload and the concept of it like all the levers are going to fall underneath the umbrella that is progressive overload, right? And so I learned a lot of this stuff from Jordan Shallow and the guys over at Prescript as I was kind of going through some of their stuff. And progressive overload represents all of the different ways that you can increase stimulation of a muscle or whatever adaptation you're going for over time. So it's not just adding weight, okay? It's not even just adding reps or adding sets. There's a lot more that goes into it because what we're really chasing isn't actually overload, it's stimulation. And so what I did learn from Jordan and those guys over at Prescript, and a moniker that they like to say is they like to use the concept of progressive over stimulus rather than progressive overload. And this makes it so that you can start to see progressive overload as the umbrella term that houses many different variables and levers that you can pull in order to get the same outcome. But each lever that you pull has very different and often advantageous risk profiles, right? So your muscles don't adapt to numbers, right? They don't know. They don't literally tell, oh my God, this week we're doing 185 instead of 175 on bench. No, they just adapt to stimulus, right? They just adapt to tension. And so progressive overload is the result. Progressive over stimulus is the actual process that gets you to the result. And so most lifters, myself included for a long time, you chase load like it's the only variable that actually matters, or you change the amount of reps you do, or you just add a shit ton of volume, like that's what matters. But the problem is that if you add weight to something, and let's say your range of motion shortens, or the amount of tension that you are able to supply to a particular muscle drops, or the control that you have throughout the rep breaks down, you didn't actually increase stimulus. You decreased the stimulus. And so a good example that Ben Pekulski, I've seen him talk about is like, let's look at your pec. So you've got the origin of your pec is here. The insertion point is all the way up here. And so basically the more that you have to, the further that this insertion has to travel to the origin and the more direct force you apply against that, the more stimulus there's going to be. So if I have to, and say I'm doing a dumbbell bench, right? And all of a sudden I go up and load. Whereas beforehand, this is a pretty big distance that my chest has to actually work. And let's say I added, 20 pounds on dumbbells, and all of a sudden I start to bring my my arm angle down to here. Well, all of a sudden this insertion point is all the way down here, and it's a shorter distance to my actual origin. And so the work that's actually being done, all of a sudden, all these other muscles start to actually work and do what I originally wanted my chest to do instead. And so this is why a lot of people, if they start tucking too much, you get a lot more front delt work and maybe not quite as much chest as you would ultimately like. Now, that's more of an extreme example, but hopefully you can see what I'm talking about here, where as weight goes up, if your leverages start to change, your techniques start to change, the way in which you move a weight from A to B starts to change, that changes the entire stimulus of everything else. Same thing as like, if all of a sudden my elbow starts bending more in this way and the weight in my hand gets closer to my midpoint, whereas before it was out here, all of a sudden, since that distance is closer, therefore there's going to be less tension on the target muscle, which is my chest, and more tension maybe on my triceps because of the angle of the joint that I have now. And just based on physics, that means there is going to be less tension here, more here. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. So if you're only going up in weight, you may have overloaded your nervous system or the system as a whole, but you didn't adequately stimulate the muscle necessarily. I say that with a caveat. Like anything, this is just the way that it all makes sense to me and a model for which you can start actually viewing it. And so I created this, just this rough chart. There's other variables that go into it, but this is a way that you can start to see what all does fall underneath progressive overload so that you can start asking better questions when you're coming up with your training scheme or when you are trying to adjust your program or whatever. So you see you have execution and intensity. So better technique, deeper range of motion, improved mechanical tension, because ultimately the number one driver of hypertrophy is mechanical tension and maximum motor unit recruitment in a particular muscle, right? So there are many ways that you can adjust this, but through load, right? So that's the one that most people do, but more resistance with the same or better form than previously. You can do reps, more exposure per set, frequency, more opportunities per week to elicit a growth response. Total number of sets in a single session. So once again, more total opportunities for stimulus. Let's say you wanted to do more sets, but with lower intensity. That's what a lot of people do in order to manage fatigue. There's a bunch of different ways that you can go about it. And then another one, resistance profiling. So making sure that your exercises actually match the strength curves so that a muscle is challenged through its full range of motion, not just necessarily the easiest part. And this is why you may see online a lot of people talking about why like they love the JM press on as a tricep instead of just the traditional tricep press down. Now, this doesn't mean that these exercises, other exercises that maybe don't do it in the full range or challenge everything in the full range, it's not saying they don't work, because they've been working for decades, right? But these are just other things that you can look at. But the most important part of progressive overload is monitoring performance in the gym and making sure that if you are going to manipulate one of these variables, all of the other variables have to stay consistent, because if they don't stay consistent, then you don't know what is actually working and what you need to change and what you need to actually iterate on. So if I, for instance, am wanting to say increase intensity, and that be my lever that I pull in order to elicit the progressive overload response and actually get that result, then what I'm going to do is I am going to do everything in order to actually increase my relative intensity per set over the course of a mesocycle. So there are many ways that I can make that happen, but everything else is going to have to stay consistent. So let's say that I used load as the way to increase intensity. So then my rep scheme would stay the same week over week, the frequency in which I do it, and then the sets that I do per session. And then that would be the one lever that I move to pull. Now, let's say I wanted to use resistance profiling and use better machines in order to make sure that I had things through an entire range of motion. So in that case, I could manipulate just the number of reps that I do and keep load the same week over week and move up from, say, 6 reps on an exercise and go all the way up to 10, 11, 12, however high you want to go. My preference is to not go really higher than 8 or 9, but it all works. Honestly, guys, most of it works, so it's not really going to matter. But you get the point, as these are just 6 of the different things that fall underneath it. But if you can start to look at and understand all the different variables you can put, they all have different risk profiles. Some of them more advantageous to others. So for some people, doing 1 or 2 more sets might help decrease injury risk, because a lot of this stuff is how long can you stay in the game? If you can stay in the game longer without getting hurt and without having to take 2-3 weeks off at a time a few times a year, all of a sudden you're not cutting out a potential entire mesocycle that you could have used for growth, because you're better at managing your fatigue and because you're better at managing injury prevention. So maybe instead of adding load every week, you focus on increasing reps or increasing the number of sets so that you can manage fatigue and slowly progress over time rather than trying to hit it all hard at once. But point I'm making here, progressive overload is a result. It is something that happens. It is not something that you actually do. It is a indicator, right? So use all these other things as inputs and start to see how you can actually make things harder in the gym. So the goal is to make as light a weight as possible, as objectively hard as possible when it comes to hypertrophy. So I hope this makes sense. Let me know if you have any other questions. Peace.